A Problem of Power. A Journal of the Holy Spirit's Activity in the Life of an Average Christian, by Connie Cook, read by the author. Chapter 12. For There's No Other Way. Most of us are probably familiar with the words of the old hymn, Trust and Obey. The first line of the refrain sums up everything I hope to say in this chapter. Trust and obey, for there's no other way. There is no other way to live a spirit-filled, self-crucified daily Christian life. There is no other key to the subject of this book, our responsibility in this problem of power, or lack thereof, in our Christian lives. The hymn writer put the hammer down right squarely on the head of the nail, it seems to me. The subject of last chapter was being filled with the Spirit, what it means and how it can happen, or at least my best guesses on that subject. This chapter will look at the results that are promised in living a Spirit-filled life. After my years of struggling and questioning and searching and wondering where, in my own life, was the power that was promised in Acts 1:8, the main conclusion I came to can be summed up in this simple formula. F plus O equals P. Faith plus obedience equals power. The formula sounds simple, but maybe we should start by defining some terms. If faith is the starting point, what is faith? Obviously, it involves belief, defined in Chapter 3 as to think to be true. But whereas I suppose it is possible to believe something intellectually without that belief affecting any part of my day-to-day life, I would say that faith involves an action of some kind based on what I think is true. For instance, I believe what I've been told about atoms, I guess. Never let it bother me much, however. My belief that everything I can see is made up of particles that I can't see has never had much of an impact on how I live my life, never having been in the path of a nuclear blast. On the other hand, I have faith in gravity. I believe intellectually that if I jump out of a plane, I'm going to hit the ground. But that belief moves out of the purely intellectual realm and into the realm of my everyday life on a regular basis. You'll never catch me jumping out of planes or stepping off of tall buildings intentionally. In Chapter 8, we discussed the commonalities and also the differences between faith in general and biblical faith. I can have faith in all kinds of things, alarm clocks and car engines and other motorists. I depend on those things. There is the action implicit in all faith. It depends. It rests its weight on its object. But in biblical faith, the object is God and only God and His revealed word. Biblical faith is simply dependence on God, giving Him the controls. Then from Chapter 8, we also talked briefly about how our faith is only as good as its object. Alarm clocks, car engines, and other motorists will, at some point, let us down. Yet if we rest all our weight on God, He will never let us down. If faith is simply letting God be God, letting Him be in control, well, obviously, He will always be God. He will always be in control. Faith will never disappoint once it's understood properly as simple dependence on God. Even if we don't get everything we've ever wanted from Him when He's in control, we can always know He's doing what's good and right and necessary. We never need to worry that He's found something that's too big for Him to handle. Now, the problem with non-biblical faith is that it is far too easily confused with biblical faith. I mean that it is far too easy to believe that the object of our faith is God when, in reality, we've placed our faith in something other than God. Let's take a look at a couple of tricky passages of Scripture, passages where I find myself wishing I could correct Jesus' words. He didn't really mean to say that. What he really meant to say was, I hope I won't end up doing that this chapter, but I think these are two passages that we can easily misinterpret. We'll examine them closely in an attempt not to do so here. So Jesus answered and said to them, Assuredly, I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what was done to the fig tree, but also if you say to this mountain, Be removed and be cast into the sea, it will be done. And whatever things you ask in prayer, believing, you will receive. Matthew 21:21-22. Is Jesus preaching a name it and claim it gospel here? Sure sounds like it, doesn't it? Not when you remember that the object of biblical faith is always and only in God and His revealed word. Mark 11 records the same occasion as Matthew 21. Mark 11:23-24 tells us, "For assuredly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, 'Be removed and be cast into the sea,' and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that those things he says will be done, he will have whatever he says. Therefore I say to you, whatever things you ask when you pray, believe that you receive them and you will have them." Whoa, really? Did Jesus really mean to say that if there's anything in particular that I want, say $1 million, all I need to do is ask for it, never doubting that I'll receive it? But in that case, why isn't every believing prayer answered? There have been people I've prayed for to be healed. I prayed for their physical lives to be extended, sincerely believing I was asking in God's will and that He wanted to heal those persons and extend their lives. In at least 2 cases that I can think of off the top of my head, the people I prayed for died of cancer. Guess you won't be asking me to pray for your healing anytime soon, will you? Was I not believing right? Was there something wrong with my faith? Let's take the case of the $1 million. If I ask God to give me $1 million, and I'm just as convinced as I can be that I'm going to get it because I believe that I'm going to get it, who or what is my faith in? Is my faith in God? Am I simply depending on God, just letting Him do what He wants to do? No, my faith, in the case I've described, would be in the efficacy of my prayers. I'd really be believing in myself and my own prayers, or my own faith. I may have convinced myself that my faith was in God to give me the $1 million, but in reality my faith was in myself. In Matthew 21:21-22, the faith and the believing that are mentioned in these verses are plainly faith and belief in God and His Word. Only He is the object of biblical faith. That fact is not quite as plain from the way it's stated in Mark 11:23-24, but back up to the verse that comes immediately before verse 23. So Jesus answered and said to them, "Have faith in God." Mark 11:22. What follows is in the context of that statement. The faith must be in God, not in our own prayers, not in anything we can do, only God. How does that context adjust our understanding of Matthew 21:21-22 and Mark 11:23-24? Well, if the only object of my faith is God, if I'm simply depending on Him, letting Him be God, letting Him be in control, in that case, when would I ever tell a mountain to go and jump into the lake? When would I ask in prayer, believing and not doubting that I would receive? The answer should be apparent in light of what faith really is. When He's told me to. When I'm acting in obedience to what I've heard from Him. If He's instructed me to tell a mountain to move, that's the only way I would be having faith in God, by speaking to that particular mountain. That's the only way I can pray, believing that what I ask for I'll receive, and still be exercising faith in God. If I believe I'm praying in God's will, if I'm simply acting in obedience. Now the obvious problem arises. How on earth can I ever be sure I've heard from God? If I'm supposed to speak to a mountain and tell it to move, how can I be sure I'm doing so in accordance with God's instructions, rather than acting on some harebrained scheme of my own that I've convinced myself is God's will? The question has a simple answer. It's found in Matthew 21:21-22 and Mark 11:23-24. The mountain will move. If I'm firmly convinced that God has told me He wants to give me $1 million, and I pray believing I'll get it, if my faith is in God, and I have heard from Him on the issue, then I'll know it when He gives me the $1 million. And if the mountain doesn't move, if I don't get my $1 million, well, what's my faith in? Is my faith in God, or in my ability to hear from Him? If my faith is in God rather than my own ability to hear His voice, then I can simply admit that God is in control, and that moving the mountain or getting the $1 million was just some harebrained scheme of my own contriving. If faith is simply depending on God, then when I believe I'm hearing from Him on a certain issue, I'll move ahead in the direction I think I've been shown if I have faith in Him. If I'm wrong about the certain issue, but yet my faith is in God, not in me, then I'll admit I must have been wrong and be content to let Him do whatever He wants to do. For instance, when I prayed for healing for the people I mentioned earlier, sincerely believing I was doing so in obedience to God, was my faith in God or in my own prayers, or in my own ability to hear from Him? It may have started out in my own ability to hear from Him, but after it was all said and done, and I arrived back at a place of saying, "Thy will be done," my faith in God was strengthened. Not because I got to see those particular mountains move, but because I realized that I didn't always hear from Him perfectly, and it didn't matter in the end. He would do what He had to do. I could rest in that fact. Any attempt to force God to do what we think He should do is emphatically not biblical faith, and it doesn't work. In that case, why would Jesus make statements that could so easily be misconstrued as permission to boss God, to tell Him how He must do things? Well, obviously, I don't know, but here's what I believe. Jesus gave us permission to act in what we think is obedience, no matter how crazy the idea seems to us. And it seems a fairly crazy thing to do, to tell a mountain to go and throw itself into the sea. Do you see what Matthew 21:21-22 and Mark 11:23-24 encourage? These passages encourage stepping out in faith. They encourage a little risk-taking. They encourage acting in obedience. And when we do and we have heard from God, the results are dynamite. Only a little dynamite can move a mountain. And that's what God promises when faith exercises itself in an act of obedience. Now there's some power. And here's the sobering thought. If I'm missing either the faith or the obedience part of the equation, I'll also be losing out on the power. If I don't believe God enough to tell that mountain to move when He's instructed me to, then that mountain is just going to sit there. But as long as we're doing our part, seeking Him, then acting in obedience according to our best lights, and leaving the results to Him, mountains will be moved. Maybe not every time. Sometimes the idea to move a certain mountain may have originated in my own little pea brain, but better to tell a mountain to move, sincerely believing I'm acting in obedience, only to have it sit there, rather than to have it sit there where it doesn't belong because I haven't acted in obedience. From the story of the Israelites crossing the Jordan into the Promised Land in Joshua 3, it occurs to me to wonder, what would have happened if the priests going ahead of the rest of the company had looked at the Jordan overflowing its banks and said to themselves, "Right then, as soon as I see the waters part, I'll step in. If this is really of God, He'll have to show me by drying those waters up. I'll be content just to wait on Him." Would the Israelites ever have made it to the Promised Land? Nothing happened until the soles of the priests' feet hit the water. That was how God had it planned on that occasion. There are times to wait on the Lord, of course. At times, maybe even most of the time, when He wants mountains to get out of the way, He Himself will tell them to move. But when we think He's told us to do a thing, if we want to see it happen, we'd better just go ahead and do it. All book long, I've been telling you that one of the main ideas I want you to go away from reading this book with is the idea that the work is God's. His work in our lives is His work, and He'll do it. He is doing it. Yet the paradox is that part of His work in our lives is to get us working too. Realizing that all of God's work in my life is really His work certainly doesn't mean that I do no work at all. But I need to do the work He shows me to do. I simply need to do as I'm told, resting in His ability to tell me. My faith must always be in God and His ability to speak to me, not in my ability to hear from Him. When I'm mishearing and acting on some harebrained scheme of my own, sincerely believing I'm acting in obedience, He's still in control. As long as I'm seeking Him and trying to obey Him, He'll find ways to show me what it is I should be doing. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct your paths. Proverbs 3:6. We can't go wrong if we're following Him. When I prayed for healing for the people I mentioned earlier, was I acting outside of His will? No, we're allowed to make all kinds of requests, even if they're ones that He isn't planning on granting quite the way we ask them. We can make all kinds of requests knowing that the ones that are in God's plan will be granted. If we're sincere in seeking Him, we can act on all kinds of ideas we think have come from God, as long as they're not contrary to His revealed will from Scripture, as long as they're not sinful, resting in His ability to correct our misunderstandings. I should tell you here that I would be leaving you with a false impression if I neglect to mention that I have seen other people I know healed over time. These healings were of relatively minor ailments, but there's no medical reason I can think of for an elderly lady's crippling arthritis to disappear completely, or for serious edema to leave badly swollen feet and ankles. Those results didn't occur overnight, but I can't help seeing a cause and effect in the specific prayers for healing that were offered in both of these cases. Both of these cases changed dramatically and for no apparent medical reason. It's given me more confidence just to ask, even when I don't know if I'm praying in God's will. If there's something I want to see happen, I can always just ask. I'd hate to have not, because I was too timid and unbelieving even to ask. Perhaps some people see more of God's visible, obvious power in their lives because they ask, or because they take risks, or because their needs are more visible and obvious, or because they have no fallback plan if God doesn't answer in the way they hope He will. Or because they take risks, they are in the position of having more visible, obvious needs, and they have no option but to ask because they have no fallback plan. Having moved in missionary circles for a few years, I've noticed a bit of a trend. People on the front lines are more likely to see God's power in action than those of us who don't dare venture out of our cushioned church pews. I've never seen God's power at work in casting out a demon. Maybe that's because I live in an area where I've never met anyone who is visibly demon-possessed. In a place where people have traditionally dabbled in witchcraft and the worship of spirits, demon possession is common. Does God still have the power to cast out demons? Is He still willing to use that power on our behalfs? I believe He is. Of course, I've never had the occasion to test out that belief. Maybe that's because I'm not on the front lines. When people in my country get sick, first we go to a doctor, and then, after the doctor has done everything he can for us, we might resort to prayer. If the nearest doctor was completely inaccessible in an emergency, we just might see more obviously supernatural healings. I don't have any great need for the gift of tongues. Most of the people around me already speak English. Those who don't are busy trying to learn it. If I found myself in a country where I couldn't communicate in English, I might begin to see the sense behind a spiritual gift like the gift of tongues. But how did those on the front lines get there? They stepped out in obedience. Small wonder that missionary stories are full of the kind of power of the Spirit that I rarely see. Now the rubber hits the road. I've confessed that I've seen a lack of power in my own Christian life. My life does not look like the lives of the early Christians in the book of Acts, or the lives of some of the missionaries I've known. What's gone wrong? As I told you last chapter, the problem is that I'm not as full of the Spirit as I could be. I'm too busy being full of myself. And why is that? Ultimately, it comes down to a lack of faith. I'm believing some wrong ideas about God, and those wrong ideas take the form of action. Somewhere I've gone wrong in my thinking and believing that God isn't really able to do what He says He can do, and then I go wrong in my action by not resting my weight entirely on Him. That's the conclusion I keep coming back to. If I believed rightly, I would act rightly. There are all kinds of things I haven't done when I thought maybe I should. There are all kinds of steps I haven't taken, all kinds of words I haven't spoken, when I've felt an inner nudging to do or say something I just wasn't willing to do or say. I've told you that the power I'm looking for is the power promised in Acts 1:8, the power to witness. I'm not primarily interested in seeing signs and wonders, but I do want to see all the power happening in my own life to do all that God has for me to do. And part of what He has for me to do is to be a witness for Him. Now, it's not true that I have never seen God's power at work in my life in this area, but all the times I have seen God work through me in speaking some little word for Him were times when I took a deep breath, shut my eyes, and jumped feet first into that old Jordan He set before me. There was some obedience required to see the power. Though I do not live a very spirit-filled or power-filled Christian life, I am so grateful for the fact I keep coming back to. Philippians 2:13. It is His work in me. Even my own obedience ends up being His work. And He is doing it. I've seen it. As I've told you, even I, even lil old powerless me, have seen Him at work in my life. It's encouraging when I see it happen. I'm afraid the words I've felt that inner nudging to write in this book aren't all encouraging ones, however. I allow for the possibility of being wrong, of course, but it seems to me that my acting in obedience will mean speaking on a subject I'd really rather not. Next chapter, we'll be looking at some specific areas, one main one really, where our society as a whole has been living in a lack of dependence and a lack of obedience to God and His Word, and the Church has unfortunately not escaped unscathed from her cultural influences. Could this one area be a reason why, in many ways, we don't experience the same degree of spirit power the early Church did? Remember, if we're putting our trust in the right object and stepping out on that trust to act in obedience, I believe we will see the power necessary for those steps. If we're not seeing all the power God has for us, we're probably, at least in some specific ways, putting our trust in the wrong object and acting accordingly.